welcome back to the Votecast. In today's episode, I sit down with nutritionist Paul Booth. Some of you may have seen that I recorded a podcast after the UTMB race to where we discussed some of the fueling strategies that Tom and Ruth used there. So I've become quite well acquainted with Paul since he provides nutritional advice for several of the athletes I coach. Paul also works as a consulting nutritionist for the Solomon team, Ministry Nutrition, and is finishing up his PhD in ultra endurance nutrition at Leeds Beckett University in the UK. Our talk today covers a bunch of different subjects, most of which I think our audience will find quite interesting, although I do manage to take us down a couple of rabbit holes. But probably the most applicable part will be Paul's description of a study that he recently finished up. And it has not been published, so this will be the first time anybody will really have had access to hear about it. And it may ruffle a few feathers in the ultra-high carb fueling camp. But it's quite an interesting study that I think will pertain to many of the people listening. So please welcome Paul, and now let's dive into that conversation. I got a couple of questions for you that I started thinking about years ago. So when I was doing graduate studies in engineering, I took quite a bit of, I studied quite a bit about energy transfer and especially combustion phenomenon. And so I know, I'm not a chemist by any means, but I certainly know what stoichiometry is and stoichiometric reactions are. And I've always wondered, so when you're doing laboratory testing, gas exchange, you're essentially relying on indirect calorimetry. And indirect calorimetry, the theory behind it is that it has to equate to like a bomb calorimeter where you're actually burning the products. And I've always thought, okay, well, how is combustion the same as aerobic metabolism in terms of energy delivery? Is it truly stoichiometric? And will we get the same energy out? And so it seemed over the years, as I've been thinking of this, I thought that's kind of that's the premise upon which all of exercise science, all these testing modalities and your kind of work is based on. Has there been any validation of that to show that these metabolic reactions yield the same energy as bomb calorimetry?
Yeah, I mean it's a big question to start on.
I know. I'm
But
sorry, I'm not gonna, we don't, as I said, this doesn't have to go into the recording, but I thought about this for years and I thought, I've got to ask Paul if he knows much about this.
yeah, I mean I suppose like the principles are the same. So again, in terms of like all the stoichiometric equations, they're all used throughout. Like obviously, when you use a metabolic cart, they're all use those to look at energy, and yeah, it works on some of those same principles in terms of all you need to do is look at the example of cycling or running economy and look at yeah, like when we create an energy, how much of that energy is lost and how much of that energy is put into propulsion. So like cycling would be the main one because actually we can view that in terms of actual watts as an output.
Hmm. Sure.
Um, so yeah, so it's I'd say fundamentally it's the same thing. I mean, with a metabolic cart though, it's difficult because as soon as you go, as soon as there's issues, and again, like there's a debate of whether actually that's correct when you go over about 80% VO2 max. So there's people who've put formulas in there uh, to try and I suppose rectify that a little bit. So again, it's like it's is there an overestimation sometimes in that as well, which could be asked.
But the thing that I remember learning in school was that stoichiometric reactions are incredibly difficult to sustain and maintain. So, looking at it from going back to my background a little bit is, in combustion phenomenon, like the only way we can, like the reason modern cars get such great gas mileage is we have really sophisticated feedback systems and controls to maintain as close to stoichiometric as possible. Um, and it only works really well in steady state conditions. And I would think that in transitory, like now taking the step over to the indirect calorimetry, where I can understand, I can believe that our body would have very sophisticated feedback mechanisms and controls as well. But one of the things that I could see as a weak point in that indirect calorimetry is if you ramp the intensity too fast, you're not going to reach an equilibrium state. You're not going to have a steady state. So you're not going to have stoichiometric reaction. And I'm thinking now is often we have lots, and I'm sure you maybe encounter this too, but many people come to us and said, well, I just went to my local health club and I did this gas exchange test, and it's really just a VO2 max test, and they came back and they said they told me my zones are blah blah blah. And I look at the ramp rate, and some of them will ramp the load every 15 seconds. They're changing, increasing the load. The long ones are a minute, a 1 minute stage. And I feel like that while you can probably achieve, or record a relatively accurate VO2 max with a test like that, I don't see how you could ever presume that during the ramp up that the body ever achieved any sort of equilibrium. So would you agree that those like ramp tests that go really quickly, rather than like 3 or 4 minute stages, they're going 1 minute stages, that those wouldn't be very useful for determining, let's say, zones or substrate utilization or any of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a VO2 max test, for example, that's ramping up way too quick. And actually, that person, that athlete, would likely not reach VO2 max before there was a different fatigue mechanism they'd have to stop. So yeah, when we work with trail runners in the lab, we'll usually do it every minute, but actually we'll look at a relatively fast pace. They could hold as a steady state, but then actually we'll go 1% each minute. Um, just some trail runners just don't have the cadence to do something like fast and flat out, like on a 1 or 0% gradient. If we're looking at doing a lactate threshold test, for me, I'll tend to do 4 minute stages and start really, really low, and then just
Mhm.
go up 1K every stage. Because at 4 minute, some people will do longer because you get more of a steady state then. But
Mhm.
actually, when I see people go longer, it quite often fatigues the athlete before you get to the end of that. And if you do a
Sure.
VO2 max test after it, the athlete's so fatigued by that point that they might not reach VO2 max again. Again,
Yeah.
because like it's not the cardiovascular system, they're just fatiguing through other mechanisms.
Hmm.
Um, Most people will go for 3 minutes on that, which is good, but I just think I don't always see someone reach a steady state within 3 minutes. So I think I always use 4 minutes, which is a good trade-off, but going up every 15 seconds, like again, if you were to look that on a graph, it would just go straight up. And
Right.
like again, something else would stop you before you actually reached VO2 max.
Okay, so well, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that if you're trying to achieve, whether it's a lactate step test or substrate utilization or something that may tell you, these like the first and second threshold, some zone help you define a zone system, that should be a different testing format than, let's say, the VO2 max test.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
if you're doing 4 minute, as you said, if you're doing 4 minute stages, most people will fatigue before they hit VO2 max because the test is going to end up being, 45 minutes long, and they'll, at a fairly, and the end of it be quite fast. So I just want to be clear, is that reasonably correct in my assumption or my thinking there? So when people come to us, they bring us, they're all excited and they said, I went to my lab and they did this. They think they're getting all this information in one test. But my intuition is no, actually, we're not getting the information we need to help you set up your zones from this test.
Yeah, and I've also seen commercial labs do it differently where like we'll take blood at the same time and look at glucose and lactate as well, whereas some people will just look at ventilatory thresholds. And then some people
Mhm.
will actually they won't do a VO2 max test. They'll do the like the lactate threshold test, the step test, and then they will just use a formula to try and predict what the VO2 max is off that. And I always find those formulas tend to come out quite high, but I feel that's maybe why some people use them because if you've got
Mm.
a customer coming in, you're a commercial lab, and you tell them they've got a 70 or 75% like VO2 max, they're going to walk away happy and potentially
Yes.
come back.
Hmm.
So yeah, so I think doing it the correct method is always, even though it takes a little bit more time. Um, yeah, like if you're going to do any of these tests, accuracy is key.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, calibrating the machine would be the first step, but then we have to assume that you would be doing that. But it also seems to me that, I mean, I guess I went down this rabbit hole just thinking about stoichiometry. I just thought, wait a minute, are we really sure that indirect calorimetry is going to give us the same results? And then I got to thinking about the non-steady state conditions that would exist in especially a rapidly ramping test ramp rate. And I also thought that, well, but when Tom, for instance, or any trail runner is out there, they're very rarely in a steady state condition. They're
Mm.
almost constantly changing. Maybe if they were so when we're doing the lab, we're getting a steady. Let's say you're trying to determine substrate utilization rates, and you do have long steps, long stages, and so you can achieve a steady state, and so you get a really quite a good idea from the gas information, carbs versus fat. But then they go out in the real world, and the conditions are quite different. Is there a way that how do you how do you make an analysis that says, so for instance, if you determine that Tom needs X a number of grams of carbohydrate in an hour when he's on a treadmill, that's going to equate to, a race condition outside? Is there, what kind of assumptions do you have to make to do that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of confounding variables when you take it out onto the trail. I mean, everything we do in the lab, and the thing is, you could do two lab tests back to back, and you would likely get slightly different results anyway. Not
Mm.
hugely, but a little bit. So whatever we do in the lab is always like a benchmark, but we've got to fill in the gaps around it a little bit and think about differences in run economy, like heart rate drift during a race, even things like dehydration, heat, carbohydrate absorption, obviously how his gut's going to tolerate, things like that. So again, the lab's going to inform us of a lot of stuff, and it'll give us a good starting point. But then we've got to fill in some of those blanks around it a little bit. But again, if like there's various formulas I can use, things like that, and then also I can look at some of his history. So for UTMB as an example, UTMB's got roughly a 12% gradient. And we know on average what Tom's pace is going to be because we know what time he wants to finish that in. So actually, we can start to stack that up, use a few formulas, look at on average how many calories he's going to burn per minute. And for Tom, I think that was about 16.6. And then we need to think about like on average what percent of his LT1, LT2 is going to be running at. So also what percentage of his VO2 max is going to be working at. And then from there, with some of the other data we've got, we can make quite a good assessment of how much fat he's going to be burning at that point, how many carbs, things like this, what he's able to tolerate through testing. So again, there's a lot of guesswork in there, but the more data we can get, the more reliable that's going to be.
Yeah. And do you find that in the testing you've done, and I know you and I have touched on this a couple of times in some text exchanges, one of my other questions is, so when we change modalities due to gradient, so he goes from running at 8% to hiking at 18%, how is that likely? I mean, I would assume there's going to be a change in substrate utilization just because the technique is different, and you're raising your center of gravity farther with each step. So probably more fast twitch fibers, more carbohydrate use. Do you see that bearing out in lab tests?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I've kind of not dipped into it far enough to look at that, like those substrate changes between like something which is relatively level and then something which is at an extreme gradient. I mean, interesting from the data we've got on Tom and some of the latest lab results, even at altitude, he was still burning a lot of fat when he was at like quite a high gradient. And I think, again, if we're thinking about different formulas, if you're at a gradient and actually you're starting to walk more, again, that'll have implications on running economy as well. So that'll start to change economy. So we need to factor that into it.
Yeah.
Um, and then I suppose like you're going to use like your calves a little bit more. So you're using different parts of the body, different muscle sets, different muscle fibers, and also as you go through that race, as those type 1 muscles start to fatigue, as they become glycogen depleted, quite rightly, as you say, you're going to move more onto those type 2 fibers, which are going to be much more glycolytic. So yeah, so it's interesting, but I mean, it'd be a great research project,
Mhm.
um, certainly. But yeah, I've not got an answer for it yet. But I think with Tom, we can definitely dip in there and look at that in a little bit more detail. From his last test, I was quite surprised actually when he was at uh, like quite a severe gradient and he was pushing it for 3 hours, how much fat he was still burning. It was still over
Sure.
1 gram a minute.
Yeah, and I think that's a really fascinating topic that I want to dig into with today with you because I know I want to talk about this whole high carb push these days. And I know you've recently conducted a study. Then I'd like to hear your, even though you haven't published it yet, if you can divulge, what you've seen in that study, I think it would be great. Maybe we start there if that's okay with you. But then I'd like to go back and talk about the fat utilization. And I've got a few questions surrounding that. So if it's okay, could you kind of give us a rundown on the study you just did and what you saw um, in terms of carbohydrate use? Because that was a field, those was field testing, right? Not in a laboratory.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. So we're trying to make it as ecologically valid as possible. So yeah, like with that, some of my ideas around that, in terms of some of the results, might segue over quite well into what you're talking about, fat utilization as well. Yeah, so that study, I'm just in the process of writing it up, but I'm presenting it at the European College of Sports Science conference in Lausanne, first week of July. But yeah, that like interestingly, as much as we kind of talk about 90, 120 grams, or even higher now, there's people out there on 140. I saw some marathon runner doing 180 grams an hour. Like I've seen people like taking up to 200 grams an hour and just really, really pushing those kind of like high carbohydrate rates. There's very little on dose response. Like there's only a handful of papers that actually look at that dose response, particularly above 90 grams an hour. And actually, there's not really any of them that have found a performance benefit yet. There's one paper which has found benefits for recovery, and then there's a recent paper from Liverpool John Moores University that found better running economy in elite marathon runners. But actually, that running economy was only improved when you jumped from 60 to 120 grams rather than from 90 to 120 grams. So there was no statistical significance on that between 90 and 120. There was no performance trial as well. So even though it resulted in like better running economy between 60 and 120, we're not actually sure if that would translate into overall performance. Because on the flip side, people complained about like greater gastrointestinal distress at 120, and we know that that's going to reduce performance time.
Mhm.
So with my study, I suppose it's the first one to dip in to look at that. So This was with sub-elite trail runners here in the UK, where we took everyone out to the Lake District and put a course together, which was 53K. So it works out over just over 30 miles, and that was 3,000 meters of ascent as well, all really runnable, single track trails, not too technical, but the traditional sort of European trails you would find like in the UK or at a race like CCC or UTMB or something similar, very similar gradients as well. Um, and that was October as well. So the temperature range was about 10 or 11 degrees Celsius. So again, not too hot. So it meant we didn't have a confounding variable, which was going to be
Hmm.
the hot ambient temperatures, which are going to raise gastrointestinal distress. So we had three groups, and this is a crossover trial. So we had one group who were on 90 grams an hour, one group who were on 120 grams an hour, and then we had a third group who were what I would call a reliability group, who took on 90 grams for. So it was 2 days. It was the first day and the second day. So groups A and B switched around. So 90 grams would have 120 on the second day, and then the 90 would go vice versa on the second day. The third group, the reliability group, we actually put those on 90 for each day
For
because,
both days.
yeah, so we could see if there's any differences, even a little bit of change in like wind direction or weather. Because this is the UK and is the Lake District. It could be red hot in the morning, snowing in the afternoon,
Mm.
quite literally. We could do some assessments on changes there. So any difference in their time, we could start to like look at the other groups and make some adaptations to that. Um, we took bloods as well. So we're looking at things like intestinal fatty acid binding protein, which would look at gut breakdown and things like that. The course itself was broken into three loops. So each loop was the same. So it was a big uphill section, was a top of the peak, which was a flat sort of technical section, and then was a long downhill section. So it meant that we could break that down into different time points. So there was electronic timing gates at the top of each one and essentially a checkpoint. So everyone would run up to the top, first checkpoint. So we'd time everyone in, then we'd do a traverse along the top, then we'd time everyone in as well. Then they'd run down, there was a HQ, so we would time them in. We would do a gut score. So we'd ask them, like from 1 to 10, how the gut was, upper and lower GI distress, nausea, dizziness, things like that. We would look at their RPE as well, and then we'd take some bloods. So we'd look at lactate and glucose. Um, and then we'd usually do that within 3 minutes. We'd give them more gels and drinks to take out. So they were blinded to the amount of carbs that they were taking each day, and then we'd send them back out. So we'd take out that 3 minutes from the overall time. So they'd do that loop three times, and then they'd come into the final, and then we did it all for a second day, 3 weeks later. And then we looked at the overall scores of that. So we would look at the individual times for each loop. Then we'd look at the individual times for each segment. So essentially, there was 9 segments in total. And then we'd look at their gastrointestinal scores. We'd look at lactate, glucose, overall scores, and then we'd do a comparison. So we picked up a serious amount of data, but the results from that and what we found was between 90 and 120 grams was absolutely no difference, like no statistical difference. In terms of overall time, um, between the groups was probably, I think it was about 4 minutes difference in total. And that was on the side of the 90 grams an hour. So on the 120 grams, everyone's about 4 minutes slower. But again, statistically, when we look at that, it wasn't really anything like there was nothing significant in that. Again, that variable was just like little things on the day. So
So
people,
four, excuse me for interrupting, but 4 minutes on what was the typical time then? Out of how many minutes?
yeah, so the fastest on that course, that 53K course overall, the fastest time was, I think, 5 hours and 6 minutes, and the slowest time was about 6 hours 15.
So we're
So
talking less than 1% difference in
yeah,
time.
exactly.
Yeah, so
So once we'd
insignificant.
pulled all these in, we had that average. Those average figures, like say, were like about 4 minutes difference, which is over that distance is absolutely nothing. And those times also, I interviewed every single runner, anyone who had like a major difference in time. When I say major difference, I mean more than 5 minutes. I interviewed them all, and some people said, "Oh, well, I had to stop and like take a pee a couple more times." One guy said his shoelace snapped, so he had to fix that. Another guy gave some walkers directions. So actually, I could account for a lot of these times. So on the whole, when we looked at not just the overall times, but the like the individual times, there was just like no difference. And then once we start to break that down, so if I look at that per loop, again, there was no difference. So I thought perhaps on the 120, there might be a little bit less fatigue, but actually there wasn't. The time on the third loop was exactly the same. So then I started to subtract like the time from the first loop from the third loop to see the difference in time between how much people would drop between that first loop and the last. Absolutely nothing. Then we broke it down even more and looked at segments. So would people be faster on 120 grams on the uphill sections? No difference again. So again, every single which way I looked at it, I just couldn't find any difference in those times between 90 and 120. Um, and I was amazed. And I spent months looking at this because you go in these things as a scientist without a bias, but really every scientist wants to find something, and I wanted to be that person who found that 120 grams was different. So I was determined to find that, but I just couldn't find it. So when we started to break down some more of that data, I was looking at like GI issues, and we did find a significant difference there. And that significant difference was that gastrointestinal issues increased on the 120 grams an hour. Um, by the third loop quite considerably. So on the 90 grams, people got GI issues, but actually they tended to plateau by the second loop, whereas actually on the 120 grams, they increased and they increased in magnitude as well. I was quite surprised at that because, again, with ultras, people really associate like nausea with an ultra, but there was actually very little nausea involved, but it was mostly upper gastrointestinal issues, so things like burping a little bit more,
Mhm.
like feelings of fullness in the stomach, like regurgitation, heartburn, things like that, which kind of pointed in the direction of there being like more unabsorbed, undigested carbohydrates sitting in the gut, because the gut's going to sit quite far up in terms of the chest.
Mhm.
So it kind of pointed at that rather than some of the things which might be associated with nausea, which might come later in a race, which is more of a response from like the gut breaking down. And that's what we'd see with the IFAB of bacteria getting through the gut and some of that nausea response coming from the blood rather than from like feelings of fullness, let's say. So that was quite interesting. So that gave us a little bit of a look in at the fact that a lot of these carbs was just not really getting like either fully absorbed or fully ingested. So again, that might be the fact that there could simply be that ceiling on carbohydrate absorption.
Mhm.
Um, and again, it might be some people might argue that yeah, it's an ultra, and actually people were running slower, but because it was taking measurements of heart rate all the way round, so we had laboratory grade heart rate monitors on every athlete. So we would measure their pace all the way around. So that'd be hooked up to a watch. Um, and then we took all the athletes in the lab. So we did VO2 max tests. We did lactate threshold tests, bunch of other tests. Um, and then we would look at these later on. And on average, in that first loop, for example, most people are running between 69 and 73% of their VO2 max. So actually, they weren't holding back; they were really going for it. And
Mhm.
this that represented for some people about 90% of their LT2, which
Hmm.
you would expect an elite marathoner to run at that pace.
Yeah.
So actually, these guys were really going for it. By the third loop, obviously fatigue was setting in. You could see those times dropping down for each one. Um, but people were still running at roughly 65 to about 69% of their VO2 max by the third loop. So, excuse me, they were really, really running at a fast enough rate to make the most of those carbohydrates. Because I've done testing with ultra runners in the past, and actually, the oxidation rates haven't been that high. And they've not been that high because they're just not running at a really kind of high rate. So actually, they just don't need that many carbohydrates. Um, so that was quite interesting. So off the back of that, I mean, I'm doing some more studies around trying to ask the questions, why didn't that 120 grams really help? But I think there might be a few reasons to that. And I think in my mind, the biggest one really is the fact that, particularly at that pace, a lot of those carbohydrates we were taking, if they were getting oxidized, they were probably just like displacing fat oxidation. So actually, it wasn't really that like they were meeting like any excess energy needs. We were just displacing a different substrate, and it's kind of as simple as that.
Mhm.
Or secondly, it might just be the fact that they hit that ceiling in terms of oxidation.
Well, that first point is the one that's kind of one of the things I want to talk about today is we're just changing the substrate because you've got excess carbohydrate available and it's easier to break down than fat. So the body's going to shift to that if it's available. Am I correct in that thinking?
Yeah, exactly. And there's some good evidence of that as well. Um, in a study from 2021 by Tim Podlegar, um, he compared 90 to 120 grams to look at oxidation rates, and he showed that. He said, "Look, was like the only major difference was that fat oxidation went down as carbohydrate oxidation went up. So all that excess carbohydrates did was just displace fat oxidation." And again, like the major outcome for that might be that, okay, so we're displacing that fat oxidation, we're putting more carbohydrates in. So that may improve running economy. But I think like the recent research from LJMU between 90 and 120 grams, even we're talking of marathon runners running a 220 marathon, like there was no statistical difference. So for ultra runners, where there is an argument to say whether running economy even is a thing in ultra running, whether it accounts very much because we've got so many other variables. I think if that's the case, then and even if it does change running economy, it'd be so minor that we just wouldn't pick up on it.
Yeah. Okay, well, this now the door is open to talk about fat utilization and fat adaptation, which is one of my favorite subjects because I've just seen the benefits of that for so many years. And we can maybe now, can we, I know you have a lot to say about that because we've talked about it with Tom, the kind of the shockingly high fat use that he has. And I know there is that I know I've shared it with you and I'm sure you've seen it, that study that Seiler did years ago showing that the biggest difference between the elite runner and the sort of recreational amateur was the rate of fat use even at higher intensities. So can you kind of expand on those ideas and give us some of your thoughts on like even though there's I mean this whole there's just kind of there's a lot of influencers out there right now talking about how many carbs per hour grams you need to be taking. And it's like the spotlight is focused on that. And in my humble opinion, that's at the expense of the importance of fat adaptation especially in athletes whose events last several hours.
Yeah, different. Yeah, definitely. Sorry. And I think like the difference also is um, there's quite broad brushstrokes over different sports, over different intensities. So again, in terms of that duration and that overall intensity, then Uh, yeah, you're going to be using different substrates purely because, like at those higher intensities, they are going to be more glycolytic in the fact that, like, fat is just not going to have the same ATP turnover. So again, we're going to be more reliant on carbohydrates, but whether we're going to be more reliant on exogenous carbohydrates is another question because there's always going to be a ceiling to how much we can take on that. It's not infinite and it just won't kind of keep going on, as people say. And with that, I suppose before we move on to fat, um, like in terms of that ceiling, what I would say is just it got me thinking today. I saw a post earlier, and someone was talking about 120 grams on this post, and they said, "Oh, yeah, it's not possible because the ceiling for fructose absorption is 30 grams an hour, and it's not. No one really knows, but people people quite often think that it's probably on a most likely on a one-to-one ratio in terms of fructose absorption with glucose absorption." Because it works upon a gradient. So the higher that gradient is, the steeper that gradient in terms of that overall pooled glucose and fructose, the more that's going to go in. And actually, when people have done over one to one, so when people give someone more fructose than glucose, let's say, it actually increases gut distress.
Mm.
Um, so again, like it's from the I don't know, probably I'm just trying to think like close to 30 years of really solid research now likely shows us that the ceiling for like glucose oxidation in terms of ingestion that is rather than intravenous is about 1.1 to 1.2 grams per minute. So the ceiling for that is roughly anywhere between sort of 66 and 72 grams an hour. And again, it's different for a lot. I mean, that's just an average. Like some people might go as high as 70 or 72, but most people are roughly about that 60 to sort of 65 grams an hour. So we know at those rates that glucose is going to become saturated. So above that, we wouldn't really want to go higher than a one-to-one ratio between glucose and fructose. Um, So really, we're thinking, okay, if you're going to feed someone, then that maximum absorption capacity is probably going to be 140 grams. So it's possible to feed someone more and actually get higher oxidation rates. But the higher you go, the lower oxidation efficiency becomes. So the more fructose you start to add to that, um, or the more glucose you add to that, like the less of that's going to be oxidized. So again, like you're kind of topping up and all of a sudden that gap's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So you're pouring more and more on, but you're getting like much less out of that. But you're also increasing the possibility of getting gastrointestinal distress. There's some really good research from our lab at Leeds Beckett University that looks at essentially an overload effect from glucose.
Mm.
So you whack in way more glucose, and what they've shown is that actually that can be detrimental to performance, and that's likely because it could end up burning through some of your glycogen stores faster. And there's a little bit of research from University of Birmingham as well to support that as well. So the fact is, the more we put on, like we're going to get to a point where actually performance might start to take a little bit of a dip there as well. Um, for me, I would say, like if you're an athlete and you want to start feeding and think, okay, I do want to maximize oxidation rates, then actually probably the best ratio is be probably sorry, 1 to 0.8. So 1 part glucose to 0.8 parts fructose. And again, you could play around with that a little bit, but you'll find like 99% of gels and drinks are either going to be 1 to 5, um, well, 1 part glucose to 0.5 parts fructose, or 1 to 0.8. So there's not actually much choice in there. Few people are doing that one-to-one ratio now for a little bit more. Moving on to fat oxidation, then.
Can I
Yeah,
stop you for just a moment before we switch gears to fat, which again is something I really want to discuss. Here's a question. I had a conversation with a cycling coach about this this whole W prime concept of going above that second threshold. And because I was saying, well, in running, we don't have much opportunity to race above that second threshold because in cycling you can go above that second threshold, but then you can draft back and be below that second threshold to kind of recharge that W prime battery, they call it. And so, and when we are above that second threshold, then glycogen use is going to be through the roof. You're going to be, or glycogen use is going to be very high, or glucose, excuse me, and fructose. But in running, maybe that's one of the reasons that cyclists could go to higher rates of grams per hour of carbohydrate is that they have this variation, maybe a greater variation where there might be surges or breaks, but then they can pull into the rest of the pack and draft. And in running, we don't have that option of drafting. It doesn't work very well. Do you think that could help explain why the studies that have been done on cycling, where they were seeing radically high carb intake, may not translate over as well to something like running, especially ultra running?
Yeah, probably. And I just think, yeah, in cycling, the Tour de France, um, again, it's just going to be much more of a reliance on carbohydrates in the fact that, like, just the workload, the work, like, they're going at, like, for the duration as well. Whereas, yeah, it's quite right. I suppose, like, with that W prime, if you think about that for running, which would be like D prime
Hmm.
across, as soon as you cross like that critical speed, yeah, in cycling, you can draft a bit and recharge that battery, as I like to think about it. Whereas running, your only option is either a descent on the other side of a climb or to drastically slow down. Because again, if you start to push that, then with O2 kinetics, yeah, you're going to reach your VO2 max pretty quickly. But I think also, particularly with ultra running, like as soon as you go into that realm and you're starting to use those type 2 fibers more, I just think you're just burning through your matches even faster.
Yeah, sure, sure. Okay, well, I just wanted to ask that one other question. I love having you here so I can ask these questions, but let's switch gears now and talk about the role that fat plays, especially in the kind of sports that where most of the people are listening to this are doing, that are multi-hour events. Um,
Uh, yeah, so with fat oxidation, um, I mean the thing is, like if you're a high fat burner, and for most elite athletes out there, and a lot of ultra runners are likely to be high fat burners. Again, um, like using going back to that example for Tom, if Tom on average burns like roughly 16 and a half calories per minute, and he's able to, let's say, oxidize well up to I've seen him oxidize up to a gram and a half of fat per minute. So at a maximum, he could be producing what's that now? 13 and a half calories just out of fat oxidation per minute.
okay,
So actually, that deficit that you need to fill with carbohydrates is quite small. And
it's
if
pretty small. Yeah.
yeah, and if you look at like Tom's VO2 max, I'm not going to give all his personal data out quite now, and where his lactate threshold is as well. On average, when he's cruising on something like UTMB, he's well below that LT1. So actually, he's in a really sort of he's in his like major fat max zone essentially. So he's burning a serious amount of fat. It'll be more glycogen depleted as well, so fat oxidation will go up. So actually, we know that we don't necessarily need to give him quite as much because, as we were saying earlier, he'll be certainly oxidizing those carbohydrates we're giving him, but actually that'll just displace some of that fat oxidation. And we don't necessarily want to bank on the fact that he's going to be burning 1.5 grams all the time. Because as soon as he hits a hill, or actually as soon as it goes hot, there's a chance that it's going to get much more glycolytic at that point. So we still need to ensure that he's got good carbohydrate availability um, for those points, particularly on UTMB. And I think, like again, using those examples of UTMB, when you look at UTMB later on, when people are overtaking each other, when people make that break, I think the ones who are able to make that break are the ones who've got that carbohydrate availability there. So if someone's
Yeah.
just hanging on because they're just burning endogenous fat stores and they just can't muster up enough ATP through like essentially burning carbohydrate stores, whether that's through exogenous carbohydrates or glycogen, then they're just not going to make that break. And I think on another example of another athlete we work with Ruth, on the year when she kind of, on what year was it, 2024, I think she had so much more left in the tank on that second half.
She did.
She
Yeah.
had so much carbohydrate availability there. It helped her just make that break whenever she needed to. And that's what made it really exciting that year as well, for spectators.
So this brings me to another question, and I'm sorry to be hitting you with all these questions without giving you a heads up about them before, but it's great. I can ask you these things off the cuff. So, is it possible that I was having this discussion with one of our coaches the other day that let's say people who get caught up with this idea that they've got to be taking 120 grams per hour, or maybe even more, they're going to do that in training, they're going to do that in racing. That will tend to, because again, I'm not the physiologist you are, but isn't it's easier to oxidize carbohydrate than fat, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
So you get a higher glycolytic flux, but you get a higher ATP turnover with carbohydrate than with fat. So if that's the case, won't the body is going to just start defaulting? If every time you go for a run more than 45 minutes, you're taking 120 grams an hour, the body is going to just say, well, I guess we don't really need that fat oxidation. And so it's going to, is there potential that those athletes who are doing a lot of training with high carb intake and certainly, and then racing with it, that they're going to become less and less fat adapted?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And it might differ a lot for elites and amateurs as well. But yeah, I was thinking about this recently just because a friend who's um, who's a nutritionist with like major cycling teams and has been a Tour de France winning nutritionist in the past. But they were saying that what they've seen with cyclists recently is almost like a carbohydrate dependence. Like they go out
Hmm.
now and they have to like have massive amounts of carbs in every single ride, and they just feel they need to, and they're dependent on that. Whether that is something real or not. But yeah, that's right. And like it's an interesting one, and there's certainly a study in there. I'm not quite sure of the answer, but I do think pe more and more people are thinking that way. And again, it depends how we're looking at it as well. So like part of the way we adapt to exercise, to that exercise stress, like one of those main ways is actually through glycogen depletion. So
Sure.
again, when that tank starts to empty out, it does send a signal that's saying, look, we need to increase mitochondria, like we basically need to adapt to this situation. So yeah, so I wonder if it will blunt that signal a little bit. Again, I could completely be wrong on that 'cause I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, there could be a bit of a dependence in there.
I remember last year when you started having Ruth experiment with higher and higher levels of grams per hour of carbohydrate. At one point, she quipped something like, I feel like I'm pre-diabetic. I'm taking in so much sugar all the time. And
Yeah,
and I also wonder if there's another confounding influence that a lot of this information that we're getting is coming from elite athletes, who through the fact that they are elite and they've been training, doing this long duration endurance training for many years, they're probably very highly fat adapted already. And then when they start adding the carbohydrates, it's like it's like supercharge for the engine. But they're already really fat adapted. But if you took somebody who's, let's say, just getting started, they don't have an endurance training background, and they're not very well fat adapted, and they start taking on these massive grams per hour of carbohydrate, I could just see that blunting their ability to become fat adapted, which, as we know, for endurance athletes, fat adaptation is a positive benefit for their overall performance. So I'm just feeling like the pendulum on carb consumption seems like it's swung pretty darn far right now. And maybe
Yeah,
has some negative side effects that people aren't really considering or talking about.
yeah. I mean, it's how the way the world works as well. We go from one extreme
Mhm.
to the other. Like we'll
Sure.
go from like full on keto, where nobody's touching carbs, excuse me, to like this point now where people are taking over 200 grams an hour, which is just ridiculous. At some point, I think it'll find its way. And I'd say on the flip side, like people have actually started to think about fueling now, and I think like we are seeing quite a positive response in terms of race outcomes and lots of records broke. Whether that's to do with 120 grams or more, I don't think so. I think it's just the fact that people are just taking fueling a little bit more serious because
Hmm.
it never used to be. I remember someone
Sure.
was telling me about, or I might listen to it on a podcast, that Lance Armstrong, probably not a good example to pick, but he said that in terms of the way they used to eat was just when you got hungry or when you felt like it, rather than anything structured. And that wasn't even that long ago.
Right.
Um, but again, it's the same in ultra running. I see a lot of even elite athletes just not eating enough, but everyone's starting to sit up and think about it. And a lot of people are saying to me, "Yo, should I eat more?" And my answer is always yes. That doesn't always translate to training though. It depends on what goes on in training. If it's, if you're running for an hour, you're not going to need carbs because actually, like carbohydrate oxidation, it usually takes 60 to 90 minutes to peak. So
Hmm.
again, you're not really going to see the benefit of those carbs in that time. And again, you might see that um, like in terms of again, mouthwash you can use, which will send a signal to your brain say carbs are coming in, which might perk you up, but it'll probably only perk you up more actually if you're in a carbohydrate deficit. But again, you still don't need to take carbs on. You can just swill a few carbs in your mouth and spit it out rather than actually swallowing them. Because again, what I'd always try and default to, and what people seem to miss out in this whole debate, is the fact that like real fueling is that fueling that takes place between sessions.
Hmm.
Like it's what you're eating every day for your breakfast, for your lunch, for your dinner, for your snacks, like good quality food, like carbohydrates, which also have micronutrients with them, fiber, like rather than just processed carbs. Like if we race fueling, sometimes that's way too late. Actually, that's an add-on to what we're doing the rest of the time. And in an ultra, yeah, fueling is really important. You're not really going to get through it without proper fueling. But actually, a half marathon or a 10K, you don't really need to worry about it. Like you just need to make sure that you've got enough glycogen in the tank to get through that because that's the substrate that you're going to be using primarily for that competition.
Sure. That completely makes sense to me. But I do think, I mean, I hear people talking about, yeah, they go for a 1 hour run and they've got to have one or two gels when they're out
Yeah,
there.
I
And
think that's ridiculous.
it's just this, I think there's a big gap. It's a little bit like we started this conversation talking about, the 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 testing in laboratories and how I think there's a the nuance of laboratory testing is lost on a lot of people. They think that they go into the lab and they spend a few $100s, they get this VO2 max test. Now they know everything they need to know about their training and whether it's their VO2 max or their zones or substrate utilization. All that's coming out of this one little test that they spent $300 on. And they don't understand the nuance that you and I began this conversation with. And it seems like the same could be said now when it comes to fueling, is that yes, you'll hear about people taking 200 grams per hour and many people on the internet talking about, or even ultra runners talking about, 120, 150 grams per hour. but then we don't hear the nuance about like, well, maybe that's not such a great idea for all these reasons you and I have discussed. And then your study, which is really fascinating, and I'm thank you for sharing that with us all because giving us a kind of behind the curtain look at what you did. I think that sounds like a great study. I'll be eager to hear how it's received when you do that presentation. But that study contained a lot of nuance. And what we're seeing is the nuance is often lost in these Instagram influencers because they've got a minute and a half to tell you how to run your life or how to train or do whatever. And I'm glad we're having this kind of a conversation because I get these questions. You wouldn't believe the number of emails and in direct messages I answer about, again, VO2 max tests. And then I'm beginning to get more and more about fueling, which I'm not at all an expert on. So picking your brain is great. But I really hope people will understand that it's not a one size fits all. It's not easy. And there's pluses and minuses that go along with it.
Yeah, and with those tests, like you've got to take it with a massive pinch of salt or electrolytes, might be more apt. But yeah, because again, particularly with trail running, like there's so many different determinants going to go into that when you come out into the lab and the trail. Like lab's a really well controlled environment. On the trail, it's far from that. Um, so again, like you might have yeah, you might have a great VO2 max, but actually what if you're not very good technical runner or you get cold really easy or something like that. There's so many different things which will play a role in that. So again, I always think these things are a bit of a guide, but I would never, I would never determine like what someone's final outcome could be from that. And again, you've got to trust the lab you go into as well. As you said earlier,
Sure.
do they calibrate the machines often? Like, do they service them often? Do they actually know what they're doing in terms of correct procedures and protocols and things like that?
Yeah. And now with these canned programs, outfits like Pinoy and Cardio Coach, and there's a number of these, the relatively cost, they're not as cost prohibitive as they used to be. You can get a setup for a few $1,000s that you can put in your health club, and they come with canned programs, for canned testing programs. So the person running the machine doesn't really have to know very much except how to turn it on and turn it off and start the test. And so I think that introduces another failure point or potential failure point. Is to have somebody who's not well trained and may not even understand what they're testing. They just know how to start and stop the machine. And yet they're the ones that are doing the test and hopefully and maybe even analyzing the results. So people need to be a little cautious, I believe, when they're just going into the local health club and asking for a test.
Yeah, well, I saw in a professional lab recently with elite athletes, someone walk into the lab, turn metabolic cart on, and then immediately start testing. And I thought, there's no way in the world any of those numbers are going to be accurate. If I do any testing, I'll go in earlier and make sure that metabolic cart's warmed up for at least 2 hours, and then I'll calibrate it and I'll check all that and I'll go through it again. Excuse me. And then often, if I don't think the numbers are right, I'll just switch and use a different metabolic cart as well. And they're $50,000. So
Yeah.
like again, if someone's not doing it and it's going to be accurate, then there's just no point in doing it. If those numbers aren't
Yeah.
realistic, then you might as well just make them up and go down the gym and say you've got a VO2 max of 80. So
Right.
because it just doesn't
Exactly.
matter really. And I suppose it's
Yeah.
also what you're going to do with those numbers as well,
Sure.
how that guides your training, how it guides your racing, things like that. So I've been working quite a lot recently on looking at fatigue processes when runners go above LT1, and does this
Hmm.
result in greater fatigue later in the race? Yeah, I thought it'd be pretty obvious, but it's not actually. It's not translated, so I'm still working on that one. But again, it's making the most of all that testing, and rather than just having a set of numbers, it's like, right, how can I make the most of these to be the best athlete I can be?
Yeah, because I mean, that's where I think we see there's a gap, but whether it's in this the laboratory testing we're talking about or fueling, is that what we're most interested in as athletes as is improving performance. And like for instance, that field test that you did with your runners on the 53-kilometer course or race, or I guess like a race, is that now we're actually measuring performance along with collecting data that should either confirm or deny improvement. But I think oftentimes people they come out again with this piece of paper from the laboratory, and then they come to me. They say, "Would you analyze my laboratory data?" And I know nothing about the laboratory. I know, and oftentimes, and you probably have seen this too. There's a 2-minute warm up before they start the test. You can see
Mm,
it in the spreadsheet that comes out that the warm up was less than 2 or 3 minutes. Well, as you know, I mean, the aerobic system takes quite a long time to really kind of come online and be functioning properly. So if you take somebody who's all they've done is walk from the car to the treadmill and get on the treadmill and warm up for 2 minutes. Well, what's the point of that? I mean, it's just they're just it's a great business model, I suppose, but it's not very helpful for us either in terms of helping them improve their performance or even to know what these numbers are. It's like the numbers are useless. And then it breaks their heart or they get upset when you tell them, well, I'm sorry, you just wasted your $300 that you spent to do this test.
yeah,
We might as
yeah.
well, we could do some very, very simple treadmill tests on a treadmill that would not involve a laboratory. And yes, they're not going to be the gold standard, but they're going to get us some ballpark numbers that we can operate with when it comes terms of setting zones and helping you with that sort of thing. And
Mm.
those are things we can then come back and retest and say, oh, look, you're running faster at such and such a heart rate now. That's a performance improvement. Um,
Yeah,
so
yeah, definitely. And with the lab testing as well, um, like I'd say to people, like get in touch with your local uni, see what studies are going on. Like when I'm doing a study, I'm always looking for people. And but with those studies, like there's quite literally thousands of pounds worth of free testing. Well,
mhm,
thousands of dollars in your case. But if
yeah.
I take someone on for a study, they'll get all that lab testing. They'll get a DEXA scan. Uh, like we'll give them quite often isotopes to look at like personalized oxidation rates and things like that. So like what we would charge commercially, lots of money for, get it for free. So people just need to speak to the local uni. There's always something going on, particularly if they've got a
Mhm.
sports department or a health department there. Yeah, in return, you might have to give a little bit of time and a little bit of blood. So just close your eyes and turn the other way while you do that. But actually, get loads of like really good, like up to date, accurate like research that you can put to good use of that. It's not going to cost anything.
That's great advice for people that live near when they can who have access to universities. Yeah, that's a great idea. I hadn't thought of that. Make yourself a guinea pig.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, we're always looking for people.
Well, I'll give them your contact information.
Yeah, that's good.
People are
Yeah,
going to
anyone in
start
the
beating your door
UK
down.
or anybody who wants to come over, everyone's welcome.
All right, good, good. Well, this has been a fascinating talk. Thank you, Paul. I knew it would be good, and I hope I didn't corner you too much on some of my out of left field type of questions, but you handled them very well. Anything else you want to close with? Some thoughts you have that we didn't touch on?
Uh, yeah, there's a few things, but
Great. No,
I'm
fire
not
away.
gonna
We
dive.
we
Yeah, I'm not gonna dive in too deep because it'd be a whole nother podcast. But yeah, just going back to what we were saying about feeding during runs. Like on a shorter run, the only time when I would get someone to actually take food on would be if we were doing some gut training. It's a good opportunity to go high for gut training, and that works really well.
Mhm.
Um, but apart from that, I wouldn't. But again, I would fuel that run, but I would ensure that someone would uh, properly fuel before it in terms of what they're eating, and refueling again after that run. So timing around the run would be important. Obviously, on a longer run, I would definitely fuel. But again, like depending on what those rates are, I wouldn't I wouldn't want to push too much in terms of super high carbohydrates because what we quite often find if someone goes out for like a long run in the day and it's quite an easy run, all of a sudden they're taking on 120 grams of carbohydrates an hour. That's like 500 calories per hour of essentially like processed carbs. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. It's just that that's going to put a big hole in someone's deficit for the day. And actually, when it comes round to meeting energy needs for the day, they get to dinner and they're like, oh, actually, I've not got much. I'll have to have quite a small dinner. Otherwise, I'll end up overeating. And it
Mhm.
means that you might not get all the nutrients you need. So again, like in the UK, I forgot like daily recommendations in the US, but we've got like dietary reference values in the UK in terms
Sure.
of how much micronutrients you need each day, things like that. So again, if you're eating lots and lots of refined carbs when you don't need to, you're going to put a dent into what you're actually going to take on in terms of overall healthy foods. And again, those foods are what's going to keep your immune system in check. It's going to stop you getting sick. It's going to essentially help with your consistency of training, which is for me above anything else. So those
That-
things are really important.
That's
So that idea of fueling, the big picture is 360 degrees. It's like it's in everything you eat rather than just isolated around or within what a run or a cycle or whatever the exercise session is.
That's really good point about, your overall daily caloric intake, plus the micronutrients that are in real food as compared to, sugar, just gels. Um, yeah, that it could be pretty, and if a person sits down to eat a normal meal after they've been taking in, 500 calories an hour for a 3 hour run, they're going to be eating too much. I mean, in terms of caloric intake.
Mm.
If
And
they're
that's
gonna
it.
if they're supplementing their normal diet with a lot of sugar.
Mm. And like, yeah, the fueling well, or what we might determine to be fueling well by taking a lot of fuel, but actually that comes at a cost as well. Um, yeah, so like we need to determine how much they need to fuel as well. So again, like for that long run, the first couple of hours are gonna if they're eating properly and fueling between sessions, then actually going to use a lot of those glycogen stores. So likelihood is we don't need to take on 120 grams an hour unless it's specific gut training, which you wouldn't necessarily need to do all year.
Right.
Um, yeah, so I think there's a lot of things that come into there, and I think like the idea of healthy eating's gone out the window a little bit, and it's been replaced with this concept of fueling.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And especially if people are, it's one thing to be training 20 plus hours a week and consuming that kind of, I mean, you're eating a lot anyway, but and so that the like it seems to me like this supplemental fueling calories need to be a relatively small proportion of your overall dietary calories. But if a person isn't training very much, I could see where the dietary calorie consumption would drop and maybe the fueling calorie consumption comes up. And pretty soon you're just living on sugar.
Yeah.
That's where you're getting most of your, and you're missing out on all those, the other very important nutrients.
Yeah. So, for example, let's say, I go on a local 10K run, and I burn 500, 600 calories or so. Yeah, that's going to put a deficit in and it's going to increase, my overall energy needs for that day. But with that, do I take like a carbohydrate drink out and some gels? Unlikely because it's just going to be at an average pace. I'll be using glycogen stores, I'll be using a lot of fat. My other option would be when I get home, actually, I'll take on some protein and some carbs, but I'll do that through like taking on some yogurt. So actually, I'm
Mhm.
taking on some calcium at the same time and other vitamins
Right.
and minerals. I might put some porridge oats in there for carbs. So actually, I'm taking on additional fiber through that as well. I
Mhm.
might put some nuts in there. So again, I might be taking on zinc and magnesium through that. So actually, I'm chew I'm not changing one thing for the other. I'm still fueling to the same extent, but I'm just looking at the smart way of going, okay, energy is what I need for this, and to make sure I'm meeting those daily energy needs. And I can do it this way where I meet a lot of my micro and macronutrient needs, or I can do it this way, which is a shortcut, which is going to cut out some of those things.
Yes. Sure. And one of the things I've noticed, and I'm old now and I'm quite slow. I I can because and but I have a lifetime history of long endurance activities. I think I'm quite good at fat burning. Is that I move so slowly now, I'm not sure I need very many carbohydrates when I'm out for multi-hour, events. I'm not racing either. I'm not pushing myself as hard as possible. I can carry a sandwich. If I'm going to be out for 5 hours, sometimes I'll just take real food. And I find that, that it's almost for me, I've done it with, eating high sugar type supplements, gels and bars and even candy bars. But I often find for me, I just don't, I mean, do you think I'm right that somebody who's old and slow doesn't need the carbohydrates as much because the rate of ATP turnover is much lower?
Yeah, I mean, I would never call anyone old and slow.
I'm
Um,
there.
I'm
So
starting to feel it myself.
yes.
But yeah, definitely. If you're if you're not going to be using as high a percent of VO2 max, then yeah, you're going to drop back and start burning fat a lot more. So again, like I'd say you're still going to burn a lot of energy, and that energy should certainly be replaced.
Right.
Particularly for some bodies who is a little bit older. But also, I'd suggest that actually someone of an older age might be wiser replacing some of those carbohydrates for additional protein.
Mm, okay.
Um, yeah, just because again, like to get the same stimulus, a 20-year-old might need 20 grams of protein, whereas someone in the 70s or 80s might need 40 grams of protein. So
Hmm.
your muscles are slightly more anabolic resistant. So again,
Yeah.
like that might be a factor a little bit there.
Hmm. Well, maybe we're going to have to come back and do another podcast about nutrition for aging athletes like myself. I think
Yeah,
there's a lot of
definitely.
us out
Yeah.
there. There's a lot of baby
Well,
boomers
certainly.
now that are still trying to be active.
Yeah, like older masters athletes. Because it's important. I think it's also something that people need to start thinking about from like the 50s and onwards, really. Um,
Hmm.
and again, like it's really important that like people understand this at an earlier age to protect against sarcopenia in older life,
Yeah,
things like that. Um,
sure.
Reduction in falls as well, things like that. Having a healthier, better quality life.
Yeah, I mean, all those things that I thought I never considered them when I was younger, and because you just yeah they don't factor in, and now oh yeah I need to be I pay a lot more attention to strength training now than I did when I was younger.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah, that's
yeah,
it. It's really important. Yeah.
yeah.
But yeah, we'll save it up and do a whole new
We
podcast.
Yeah, we do. We should talk because we do have, a lot of the folks that we deal with are in middle life. They're in their 40s to 60s.
Mm,
They now, they're able to, they have the money and the time to spend on activities, foolish activities that we talk about all the
yeah.
time. Um,
Well, that's it. People can easily be running into their 80s and 90s. Like it's just making sure that kind of you keep on top of it, you do the strength work, you eat properly, and you don't listen to all those people who tell you it's bad for your knees and to stop running. That's the worst thing.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. I've had, as I think I've had both my knees replaced. It's been years now, and I'm not a high mileage runner, but that's more just because of time and you just don't have the opportunity. But I still probably run 30 to 40 miles a week. And
Yeah.
when I see doctors, for instance, and I tell them, yeah, I've got both knees replaced and I still run 30 miles a week. I've been doing that for 15 years. They can't believe it. He said, you mean you run on those knees? I said, hell yes, I run on these knees. I mean, why not? That's why I got these knees, so I can
Yeah.
run again. Um,
Yeah.
so I think there's just information like that even with doctors, they're surprised. They think, oh, if you have knee replacement, you shouldn't be running. Um, so I had to do quite a bit of searching to find an orthopedic surgeon who, when I said, "Hey, I want to run after this," most of them they would just say, "Well, you're nuts." And I found one who just said, "Hell yes, you can run after this." And so that's the
Yeah.
guy I chose.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that's it. It shows it's possible.
Sure.
But people always know it's dangerous. You shouldn't be doing it. No, not at your age, people will say. And no way, just yeah, get out there and do it. It's key.
Yes, it is. And I think, and often people will ask me about nutrition, which again, I'm far from an expert. Should I take this supplement or that supplement? And often my best advice is try it and see what happens.
Mm. Yeah,
And
yeah.
if you take whatever, I don't care if it's creatine or fish oil or whatever it is you want to try, try it. And then if in a month or two you don't notice a difference, well, then you've done this great experiment on yourself and you decide else it's worth continuing or it's not, rather than just relying on what you hear on Instagram.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
There's too much of that goes on.
Yeah. Cool.
Well, Paul, it's been a blast talking to you. Always is. I love picking your brain. Thank you so much for taking the time and allowing. And I'm really excited about this study, and I think people are going to love hearing that behind the scenes account of how you designed the study and what you got out of it. And yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's really valuable.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Yeah, I think it'll rustle a few feathers. I think I'll be called a carbohydrate hater or a low carb guy after it.
Yes, exactly.
But again, I never went into it intending for that. That's just how the results are. I've got no bias.
Yeah.
So yeah, don't hate on me.
Yeah. No, and if you do ruffle some feathers, I find that's actually often a good thing. So ask hard questions, push back a little bit, think outside the box, or in this case, you thought outside the box in the way you structured that study, and it gave you kind of an outside the box answer, a response. I mean, the outcome of that study was not something you expected.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's it. I might avoid Instagram for a bit after that study. I'm not sure if I can go into witness protection for a second time. Just
For a second.
the strong feelings around carbohydrates at the moment.
Oh,
Uh,
there are. Yes, there are. And it's yeah. Well, we can put a little black bar across your eyes in the podcast if you
yeah,
want, so that
yeah,
no one will recognize you and make you
yeah,
anonymous.
cool.
Okay. Well, thanks
Brilliant.
again, Paul. I really appreciate it. It's great chatting with you. Um,
Great.
and
Cheers, Scott.
good luck in your race this weekend.
Yeah, yeah, I'll need it. I'm gonna do it with my wife. So yeah, we'll just go out and have fun. Be okay. I mean, some like right across the Yorkshire Dale, so it's close to home. Nice scenery. Yeah, it should be good.
I'll bet. I hope the weather's decent.
Yeah. Oh no, it's looking great. Yeah, which it usually isn't, but yeah, it's very good at the moment, which is good.
That's good. I hope it holds on for the weekend. All right. Well, you
Cool.
take care.
Cheers, Scott.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.